Well, good morning, everybody. Well, first of all, it's a pleasure to be here. I like coming here. And I like what you do out there in the morning when you come together and you pray and you talk. You create a real sense of community. Something very special about that. And not many places do that, so I hope that you all value that. I don't mean I hope that you all value that, but I hope that you all value it. Before I kick off, I need to ask you something. This here, what is this? Any suggestions? Right. So, when I come to America, your strange country, like if I go into a store and I say, "Could I have a bottle of water, please?" And they'll go, "What?" I say, a bottle of water, please." They go, "What?" But if I say, "A bottle of water," then they get water. So I just think that's really, really strange. So it's like we're just separated by language in such bizarre ways. Anyway, that's a by the way. It just struck me as I was sitting there. So Ben said to me, "I don't mind what you talk on, just don't be stuffy and boring." So I'll do my best not to be stuffy and boring, but I can't promise, because that kind of narrows the parameters a little bit. So the title that I want to speak to today is Raging with Compassion. So a number of years ago, I wrote a book called Raging with Compassion, which looked at pastoral responses to the problem of evil. And basically what it argued was that theodicy, that kind of formal philosophical and theological explanation of evil, tended to be more damaging than explanatory, and more damaging than healing. And so I came to the conclusion that actually Scripture doesn't give an explanation as to what suffering's about. But what it does do is gives a series of practices of redemption within which, if we participate, we can stand against evil and stand against suffering in quite particular ways. So this morning I want to develop that way of thinking and maybe move beyond some of the things that I've thought before and begin to think about that in the context specifically of Holy Week. Because it seems Holy Week to me is a profound statement against the evil of the world. And a profound way of being in the world is manifested in what we learn from Holy Week. So what I'd like us to do is to think about what I'm going to be talking about as a kind of extended meditation on suffering, wherein we can use our critical faculties, and so we should do, but also we enter into the experience of suffering, because suffering is not a concept or an idea, it's a meaningful human experience. And more than that, it's a contextually bound human experience. People suffer differently in different contexts and according to different belief structures and different ways across time and across cultures. What I want us to think about today specifically is how do we as Christians suffer? And what resources, what practices are available within the Christian tradition to help us to resist evil and suffering in ways that bring about faithfulness and new hope. And I want to do that through telling a story. So there'll be a central narrative that runs all the way through everything that I talk to you about. But by interacting with that story, we'll begin to see how theology can help us. A number of years ago, Walter Brueggemann, Old Testament scholar, wrote a fascinating book on the spirituality of the Psalms. And one of the things that he noticed in that book was the way that the Psalms were intended to facilitate both life and facilitate suffering. They give a language to suffering, but they also give a shape and a form. And the way that he runs with his thinking is that some Psalms are, like the Royal Psalms, for example, are intended to tell us that everything's fine. So the Royal Psalms, everything's fine, God is in his heaven, life is all right, everything's all right. But then there's a second set of Psalms, the Psalms of disorientation, he says, where actually all of that falls apart. And you discover something completely different about God, and you don't really like that complete difference. And then the third set are the Psalms of reorientation, where you come back to a place where you can at last begin to see something of the grace and of God, something of the love of God. But everything's changed, because suffering changes everything. Now, it struck me as I was thinking about this lecture that process of orientation to disorientation to reorientation is a good model of Holy Week. So you have orientation, you have Palm Sunday where everything's good. Everybody's filled with excitement. Everybody's really knowing that God is in his heaven and something fantastic is going to happen. But then you have the Passion, where everything falls apart. All of the hopes disappear, all the possibilities move on, and you find yourself completely disoriented. The disciples found themselves disoriented. Everybody who believed in Jesus found themselves disoriented. And then you have the cross, and then you have the resurrection. And the reorientation of the resurrection isn't moving back to Palm Sunday, because everybody sees things differently. Now, the reorientation that comes with the resurrection takes us in a completely by surprise, in a completely new direction. So hold these two frameworks, Holy Week and that idea of moving from orientation to disorientation, hold that in your mind as we go through this, and we'll begin to see how that can help. Now, the story that I want to guide us comes from when I worked many years ago as a hospital chaplain. I worked within the area of mental health for some time, but I also worked in a more general context, in particular within the area of HIV and AIDS. And so this story comes from that particular context. My sister is a midwife. And I was going to explain to you what midwives do, but you probably know what midwives do, because you have midwives in America as well, don't you? So she spent all of her life bringing life into the world in particular ways. And she's always struck me as somebody that's very important, very special in that way. About 10 years or so ago, I went to her house to visit her. And when I was there, I met a young lady. The young lady was by the name of Jen. And she had just had a baby. So my sister had delivered the baby, and now they've become friends, and she came to visit. When I met her, she was quite well. She was quite good. She was in a good space. And she was a Christian. She went to a charismatic evangelical church, and she really was somebody who was quite inspiring in terms of her faith and her faith life. So I never met her again until 5 years later, when I was working as a chaplain in this ward, which was that time was called an AIDS ward. Now, at that moment in time, the hospital unit that she was in the process of closing down. So there were only 2 patients in it. And it was one of these old units, right down beside the sea in Aberdeen. One of these old units that used to be a tuberculosis unit. So people would go down there and they'd be exposed to the elements, exposed to the sea. But now it was simply for these 2 people. And it was one of these units with a big, long corridor. And they had, for whatever reason, they had 1 patient at one end and 1 patient at the other. And so I went into this ward and I sat down, and I suddenly realized that this was the same woman. But by this time, she'd lost probably 5 or 6 stone. She was in extreme pain. Her colon was ulcerated. She was beginning to lose her eyesight because infections in her cornea had begun to eat into the back of her cornea. And she was in a very difficult place. And so let's think about that. When I first met her, she was in that point of orientation. She knew that God was good. She knew that life was okay. And she ran with the Psalms and the psalmist, believing that the world was all right. Importantly, she also was deeply engaged with a group of people who claimed to love her, and who did love her, who claimed to love Jesus. And so her point of orientation was there. When I met her, everything had changed. So all the old ways of dealing with things, all the old ways of coping with things had begun to be put under pressure. From her perspective, she felt that I've been a faithful Christian all my life. I've never done anything wrong. What could I possibly have done wrong? How did this happen? And then I began to listen to her story. And she told me her story, and this is how it ran. So when I had met her, she had just moved into a new house and not long moved from Edinburgh to Aberdeen. And what had happened to her was this. She had gotten married when she was quite young, and she moved from Aberdeen to Edinburgh. And she had a really nice life with this young man. But unbeknown to her, this young man was an intravenous drug addict and also very promiscuous. He ended up with HIV, didn't bother to tell her, and then surprise, surprise, she became infected. And so not surprisingly, the marriage broke down and she came back up to Aberdeen. She married another man in Aberdeen, and they really wanted to have a child. And so the medic said, you mustn't have a child because it's too dangerous to have unprotected sex. They decided, on the basis of faith, that God wanted them to have a child. And so they had unprotected sex once, and she became pregnant. And the baby that I met the first time we got together was the product of that tragic story, which ended up in something very, very beautiful. And so her journey had been really, really problematic from orientation to disorientation. But when I met her in that ward in the first place, she was disoriented. And so she was experiencing what you might call a certain kind of suffering. So Suzanne Sontag, very interesting literary scholar, wrote a book many years ago called Illness as Metaphor. And in that, she looked at the way in which the language and metaphors that we use around cancer can be highly problematic for people who are living with cancer. And so the emphasis on battling, on surviving, and cancer as the enemy can make it very difficult for people who simply want to live into their illness and find positive but not non-violent ways of articulating the relationship with cancer. And she herself was a breast cancer survivor, and she began to think about this book when somebody referred to her breast cancer as a dirty illness. And so that affiliation of cancer with dirt stimulated in her mind a significant problem in the way that we articulate particular forms of suffering, particular forms of illness. In a second book called AIDS as Metaphor, she embarked upon a similar venture. She looked at AIDS, which is basically a virus. It's nothing more than that, nothing less than that, of course, as well. But once that virus gets into the social sphere, it becomes highly problematic. And so it draws to itself ideas and metaphors of deviance, of addiction, of alienation, all sorts of things. So to have something like HIV is not the same thing as to have something like measles, she says. HIV is not like measles. It's something else. And it's a certain kind of suffering because the kind of social context within which you experience your suffering profoundly impacts the way that you suffer. But one of the most disturbing things for her was spiritual stigma. So the first response from many people within her religious community was to say this was some kind of punishment from God. So HIV invades, all these metaphors that come in, punishment from God. And the thing that she didn't understand was how could that same group of people that were so welcoming and so loving to her at the same time hold such beliefs that were so alienating and so stigmatizing for her. And in that sense, she resonates with that movement from Palm Sunday to the Passion, to the crucifixion, where that same group of people, or many of the same people, change their mind, shift the perspective, and begin to stigmatize Jesus in a similar way that we stigmatize Jan. And stigma is profoundly devastating. Now, to stigmatize somebody is to reduce them to the smallest part imaginable. It's an idea that comes from, Goffman says, it comes from the slave trade, the Greek slave trade, where you would buy somebody and then you'd put a mark on them, and that person would be reduced to the size of that mark. They're no longer a person, they no longer have a name, they simply are that mark. And that's precisely what stigma does. And stigma does that in mental health, but stigma clearly does that in her. And so even though her community were proclaiming the same love of God, the same love of Jesus, this pathogenic belief meant that she was no longer a part of that community. She was part of it, but at the same time, no longer a part of that community. And she found that really, really difficult. Because how can it be that your brothers and sisters can hold you in such an unhelpful way? Dietrich Bonhoeffer talks about a suffering, a mode of suffering that's very similar to that. He says, Jesus did not only suffer, he suffered and was rejected. If Jesus' suffering is simply framed as tragic, it could convey its own value, its own honor and dignity. But Jesus is the Christ who was rejected in his suffering. That Christ not only suffered, but was rejected. That Christ was not only suffered, but was rejected is important for Bonhoeffer's theology of suffering. The rejection and humiliation of Jesus makes his suffering dishonorable. Now, the power of that passage comes when you place Jesus' dishonorable suffering beside the dishonorable suffering of someone in a position like Jen. We talk about the identification of Jesus in suffering, but it has a very particular, very sharp, and also a very healing meaning within that particular context. For her, her identification with Jesus was profoundly important. It may be that her community struggled, but Jesus, even in the midst of her ignominy, begins to be with her in significant ways. And so the broken body is very important, and what we might call the epistemology of the broken body, the knowledge and understanding of suffering that we get from the broken body of Jesus is very important. So this picture here is a picture by Matthias Grunwald from the Middle Ages, and it's part of a triptych that sat in a plague hospice in Germany. And if you go closer to that picture, there's two things that you will see that are very important. The first thing to notice is Jesus' hands and Jesus' feet. So Jesus' hands, unlike many pictures or art from that, much art from that area, are contorted in agony. If you look at a lot of art that comes out of that particular period, Jesus is kind of passive. He's on the cross, but he's clearly not experiencing anything particularly significant, or so you would think. But in Grunwald, he wants you to realize that the suffering of Jesus was real, that it's something that you need to look at and read to see. You know, Martin Luther, in his Theology of the Cross, one of the criticisms that he brought of the church was the tendency to look beyond the cross, to look away from the cross, to look around the cross, which is exactly what Jen's congregation was doing. They were looking for explanations. They were looking for a way to explain something that she's done or something somebody else has done. They were looking round, up, above, underneath, but not looking at her suffering. And so Martin Luther says, to understand the nature of who Jesus is, you need to look at the cross. You need to see the suffering, and you need to reflect very carefully on what that means. Theologies of glory don't get you anywhere. Theologies of the cross take you to the heart of who Jesus is. And so if we look even closer at Jesus' body, we can begin to see something else. On that body, in that picture, is the pockmarks of the plague. And what Grunewald wants us to see there is God's total identification in the midst of suffering, taking upon himself the suffering of the world, or in this context, the suffering of the plague, in order that we can find redemption through the identification of who Jesus is. And redemption leads to hope and hopefulness. But the pain of the cross is no less because of the hopefulness that it brings. So, don't move too quickly from cross to resurrection would be the thing to think about there. And so for Jen, her suffering was more than suffering. Her suffering was affliction. Simone Weil talks about affliction like this. She says, affliction is an intensity of suffering that empties out our sense of self, destroys all our hopes, shatters our sense of being at home and safe in the world. In the realm of suffering, affliction is something apart, quite specific and irreducible. It's quite a different thing from simply suffering. It takes possession of the soul and marks it through and through with its own particular mark, the mark of slavery. There's no real affliction unless the event has been gripped and uprooted. A life attacks it directly or indirectly in all its parts, social, psychological, and physical. Now, Simone Weil was talking there about the plight of workers in France, but it applies very much to the kinds of suffering that you experience and the kind of suffering Jen experienced. Because it was dark. Because it was a sense of abandonment, not simply by her community, but also a deep sense of abandonment by God. How could it be that I have been faithful, that I've raised my hands in worship for so many years, and now this happens? And so she empathized really with Jesus Christ from the cross. My God, why have you forsaken me? Now, the most powerful thing about Jesus' cry from the cross was the change of language. No longer did he talk about God as Abba. Now he talks about God as someone at a distance. My God, why have you forsaken me? So the intimacy of the Abba moment seems to be stripped away by the pain and affliction of suffering. And that was clearly Jen's experience as well, because sometimes, no matter how much she lamented, God seemed just simply to disappear. And again, Martin Luther talks a lot about the hiddenness of God, the way that God sometimes just disappears. Walter Brueggemann, I think, puts this quite nicely. He says, popular, easy, reassuring religion imagines God's constant attentiveness to us, but we know better. We know that to live in God's world is to live being abandoned, to face a free fall, an absence and a loneliness that go all the way to the bottom of reality. This Friday cry of Jesus calls us to relearn about faith and obedience and discipleship. Jesus is not the first one to know about being forsaken. He quotes a psalm. Old Israel knew well before Jesus about being abandoned by the God in whom they trusted. Now that's very dissonant for many of us, and particularly for many of us who have a certain evangelical and theological position. The idea that God disappears seems strange. And yet Brueggemann points out that Scripture's full of points where God seems to just no longer be available, no longer be listening. And the Psalms of Lament are all about that. When I cry to the Lord, I hear nothing. And at one level, God is with us. So in Deuteronomy, we find this statement, for the Lord your God is merciful God, but he will not abandon or destroy you or forget the covenant with your forefathers, which he confirms to them by both. But at the same time, Isaiah says, truly you are a God who's been hiding himself, the God and Savior of Israel. So you have this really strange tension between the presence of God and the absence of God. And it's a disoriented tension because you don't know what to do with that. And when you're in the midst of that kind of suffering, you don't know what to do with that because surely, as the Royal Psalms say, God should be here reaching in, pulling me out, but here I am, and God seems to be somewhere else. And on Holy Saturday, Jesus descends into hell. None of us know what that means, but it's supposed to be a pretty dark place. And the psalmist says, darkness is now my only companion. You know, some of the psalms, even the Psalms of Lament, end in victory, but sometimes it's just darkness. It's just nothing there. John Colwell, a systematic theologian from the United Kingdom, wrote a fascinating book, which is a theological reflection on Psalm 22 and Jesus' cry of dereliction from the cross. Now, Colwell lives with bipolar disorder, and so his life is full of highs and lows, some of which are biochemical, some of which are spiritual. But his life, he understands the meaning of darkness. And what he does in that book is he begins to use his theological skills in conjunction with his experiential perspective to explore that cry. And he looks at various ways in which darkness manifests itself through Scripture. But at the end of the day, he begins to realize that the Psalms of Lamentation teaches very clearly that actually feeling abandoned, feeling God's absence is part of our spirituality. He says this, I'm calling for a renewal of the recognition that the Psalms of Lament, echoed in the cry of Jesus, are spiritually normative. The periods of felt abandonment are not to be shunned or misconstrued as spiritual failure. Let us pray that this darkness doesn't engulf us in any of its forms, but if and when it does, let us not misconstrue it as spiritual failure or mistake our feelings or forsakenness for the reality. As in the case of Job, he says, there is probably vastly more occurring here than we can possibly comprehend, and certainly more occurring here than we can immediately perceive. Now, his point is, don't race to theodicy. Don't race to explanation. Recognize, even if it's mysteriously, that deep, dark absence of God is part of our spirituality, and indeed, perhaps, part of our formation. So for Jan, she went through all of these things, and there were times when I would sit with her, and others would sit with her because her church was very good. They visited regularly, and there was just nothing to say. And having nothing to say is very difficult. God didn't take Jesus off the cross. But then we get to that point, both in Holy Week and in the Psalms of orientation to disorientation to reorientation, we get to that point of reorientation. What might that look like? Well, first thing to notice is that suffering can easily turn into evil. Now, by that I mean evil is a word that has multiple meanings, and people interpret it in lots of different ways. But I like to think about evil this way. Evil is anything that stands in the way of God's redemptive love. So evil is these things, and they can even be small things, that block us from recognizing who Jesus is, that block us from recognizing what love is, and block us from participating in God's redemptive processes. One of the most profound modes of evil, particularly in a situation like Jen's, is pain. Now let me explain to you what I mean by that. Pain is profoundly depersonalizing and profoundly alienating. So Elaine Scarry talks about pain in this way. She says, pain either expands to fill the whole of your body, or your body expands to fill the whole of the universe. You know, if you have a small pain, you can think about nothing else. If you stub your toe, you can think about nothing else. So how much more if you have that big existential pain that comes with profoundly serious illness. So pain blocks your relationship with yourself, blocks your relationship with other people, and blocks your relationship with God. So pain is, as Stanley Hauerwas puts it, pain is the enemy of community. So there's something profoundly important about that. But that then puts an interesting slant on medical care. Because if you take something like pain medication properly and faithfully prescribed puts you back in touch with yourself, puts you back in touch with the neighbor, and puts you back in touch with God. So in that sense, pain and medicating pain is a spiritual practice. It's a mode of redemption in that way. And for Jen, it was impossible to have any sense of presence with her unless her pain was under control. If her pain was under control, she could be present. And if she could be present, then other people could be present with her. So the first mode of orientation came from medicine in that sense. Medicine faithfully applied, rather than medicine simply for medicine's sake. So once the pain's in control, it's possible to be present. However, being present is a profoundly difficult and a deeply painful thing to do. Sometimes it's easier to suffer than to watch suffering. To sit with somebody, I often think about, what it must have been like for Mary to sit or stand at the foot of the cross and watch her son in such mortal agony. And when you look at Grimwald's picture and you think of what Mary must have been going through, it's horrendous. So to be present with somebody requires courage. There's the courage to recognize what's going on here and the courage to stay, because the temptation is always to walk away. That's easy. But to be present means to do what Mary did, is to stand there, to weep, to struggle, but always to be there. But being present is a complicated process. It's a process that begins in some senses with silence. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, in his Christology book, the first line in there says, all theology begins with silence. Now, I wish that was the case. No offense, theologians. But I just sometimes wish that theologians would just be silent for a bit and think about it. Because the temptation, particularly when we're dealing with suffering and evil, is to be noisy, is to offer explanations. But Job's comforters were doing really well when they were silent. It was when they started to speak there was a problem there. But the problem with silence is it's really, really awkward. It's difficult to be present with somebody and not to say anything. I've spent many years working with people with profound intellectual disabilities and also people with dementia. And one of the most difficult things is just to be in that room with somebody and to be silent. And to be alongside somebody, for example, who has just had a stroke and has lost the language is profoundly difficult. Because what do? We're just really not used to sitting silently with one another. But the beginning point for presence is silence. And then the movement, Scripture tells us, from silence is into speech. So if you think about the cross, that's how it ran. Jesus was silent. He hadn't said anything. He was absolutely silent. And then he breaks his silence with a psalm, Psalm 22. But one of the things about the Psalms is this. Some of them end just flat with darkness is my only companion. But the majority of the lament Psalms have a fixed pattern. So you begin with that huge outburst of anger and frustration. The world is not the way that I wanted it to be. This cannot be fair. And the psalmist is remarkably honest. Lord, smash the Babylonian babies' heads off the rocks is not the normal thing we sing in worship. Yeah. In fact, actually, it's funny, C.S. Lewis says that actually asking God to do that is worse than doing it yourself. So but that's probably for another conversation. But then in the middle of the majority of the lament psalms, something shifts. So nothing changes other than that the psalmist recognizes for God has said, God's unending love. And when the psalmist recognizes God's unending love, he can move on to praise. And so when Paul says pray at all times, it sounds ridiculous until you think about lamentation. Because it is a way in which you, even in the darkest of your moments, you can pray. And for Jen, praying the Psalms was really, really important. Because she was frustrated, she was angry, but she was faithful. But how do you find a language when most of the time, particularly within her congregation, happiness and joy are the marks of faithfulness? And so presumably sadness and pain are the marks of unfaithfulness. So she had to, in some senses, relearn that language. And my job as a chaplain was to help her to relearn that language. Secondly, to be present, to begin that process of reorientation, is to learn how to wait. Harry Vanstone has an English Anglican theologian, wrote a book many years ago called The Stature of Waiting. And it's a reflection on the Passion. And one of the things he talks about is the way in which Jesus waits and the way in which God waits over time. And he says, in order to wait for something, you have to have something to wait for. In other words, if you're not waiting for something, then you're not waiting at all. And there's a real beauty in that. So what is it that you and I are waiting on? What are we waiting for? I mean, a lot of the Christian life is all about waiting before the eschaton comes upon us and everything becomes beautiful again. It's a matter of waiting. And so the practice of waiting and how we wait together is profoundly important, both eschatologically and pastorally in that sense. And for Jen, waiting was interesting. Finding reasons to wait. So she had a theological structure. She wasn't worried about dying in that sense because she knew what that was about. She knows where she was going. But she was worried about other things. What was she waiting for? And the thing that she was waiting for in that context as she moved towards the end of life was her identity as a mother. All I want to do is to hold my child, she said. I remember she said it over and over again. And because she was so weak, and because life was so difficult for her, and because she was in so much pain, so to hold anything was really painful, holding her baby was really difficult. But that was the thing that she wanted to do. That was the thing that gave her meaning. That was the thing that she was waiting for in that context. And to be fair, the nurses were really, really good for her in that midst of that. They would help her they would hold her together. They would help her to hold her baby. And in that sense, she could wait for and with her baby in the midst of a theological context where she was comfortable with. The power of waiting with her baby was transformative for her because it gave her meaning in that moment. And it gave her that sense of identity about who she wanted to be, because all she ever wanted to be was a mother. So taking the cross route. So from my point of view, being present was painful and difficult and disappointing. Now I often think about, when the Emmaus Road, when the disciples say, but we had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. And what is more, it's the third day since all this took place. These guys were really disappointed. The cross contains deep disappointment as well as it contains deep hope and future possibilities. And so in order to be present for somebody in Jen's situation, it was necessary for me to recognize I couldn't do very much, and not to be offended when she asked me to leave, and not to be offended when my skills were not necessary anymore. So taking the cross seriously means embracing disappointment. And finally, or penultimately, I just want to give you one more concept or one more way of thinking about this. Simone Weil says that affliction produces a deep sense of not being at home. Brueggemann again talks about the idea of homefulness. That when God creates the world, he makes that our home. So homefulness relates to being at home with one another, being at home with a community, being at home with creation. And perhaps one of the most profound acts of resistance that we can engage in is to help people feel at home in the midst of suffering. To begin to reconstruct their lives, reconstruct people's identities so that they recognize that this new person that they have become through this experience of suffering can be at home in the world. And that even in the midst of the difficulties that people have, homefulness is a possibility. So, practicing the presence of God in suffering. These are the practices that I'm suggesting to you. Resist evil, resist suffering. Homefulness, lament, friendship, searches for meaning, faith, waiting, patience, silence. As we engage in these practices, so we engage in a very powerful act of redemption and resistance against evil and suffering in the world. When we engage in these apparently simple practices, we become people who do not tolerate evil, but know exactly how to talk about and to live with suffering. Practicing the presence of God may be the most important thing that any of us ever do. Thank you for listening.
So I want to give you an opportunity in the next 10 minutes if you have a question, something you want clarification on or further explanation of, which would be in the form of clarification. I'll bring you the mic if you have a question. While you're thinking of your questions, I'll let you know that Western Theological Seminary is hosting the Summer Institute on Theology and Disability. So if you Google Summer Institute Theology and Disability 2019, you'll find all the information, including registration, speakers, breakout sessions. The whole schedule's there. And we'd love you to join us and be a part of that.
Thank you, John, for a deeply thought-provoking presentation. I was struck by your comment on pain as the, how did you describe it, the enemy of community. And I'm wondering, so I have a question, I'm wondering if you can respond to it, that is pain, is that all that pain is? Or could pain also be a threat, like a gateway to community? Insofar as you're talking about presence, is it possible to be present to our pain in such a way that the pain, if we listen to it and follow it, it guides us to the barriers within ourselves that are preventing us from being connected to others, instead of having to resist the pain or eliminate the pain in order to be connected to others? Is it possible that the pain is identifying the ways that we're preventing ourselves from being connected? Does that make sense?
Yes, that makes sense.
Well, I'm wondering if you could respond to that at all.
Yeah. Well, there's a couple of things I would say to that. One being that pain is not a fixed concept, so people experience pain differently in different ways, in different spaces. So there are certain forms of pain which do nothing but block you from everything. So if you're in excruciating agony, it's most unlikely that you're going to be thinking about what existential lessons you're learning from this, although you may do later on. So once the pain has been eased, you may well find that there are things that you can learn from that pain. But there are other types of pain. So the whole idea of the dark night of the soul has to do with a certain form of psychological pain, which is not the same as depression, but it's a certain form of darkness and alienation from God and self and others, within which you discover and encounter things about God that you wouldn't have been able to encounter at other points, so that you then emerge from that reformed in quite specific ways. So that type of pain functions well. And of course, some types of physical and psychological, other types of physical and psychological pain can bring about different ways of thinking in that sense. But my general sense for the type of pain I've been talking about here, is you're unlikely to learn very much about it when you're in the midst of it. So there's an ambiguity there, I think.
I was struck by your definition, or when you said that pain stops us from relating to ourselves, relating to others, relating to God, because it made me think of a line from John Stott in Basic Christianity, where he says basically that about sin, that it stops us from ourselves, from others, from God. I wonder if you thought about a relationship there at all.
I haven't thought about that, but I can see exactly what that would mean, because sin turns you in on yourself, but it also turns you in on a mode of yourself that's quite false. So it turns you in yourself and separates you from other people, but even the self that it turns you in on isn't your true self in that sense. So sin is totally alienating in a slightly different way, but ultimately there's a good deal of similarity between these two things. So I can see exactly where the connection would be. Yeah. You've got to be kind because you're my student.
I've missed you too.
That's right.
Would you say that there's a difference between like pain and discomfort, right? Like I'm listening to this and I'm thinking it'd be too easy to go from pain as a negative equals because of sin, right? When I'm not convinced that everything that hurts us or everything that's uncomfortable for us is bad, evil, right? There's certain things like growing pains, right? Or even just the process of maturing, spiritual growth, learning lessons.
Sure.
That's painful, but it's not bad, right? So you're saying is there a difference between like pain and negative, or is pain always a negative?
No, pain's not always negative. I mean, if you take something like leprosy, I mean, one of the things that leprosy does is it destroys the neurological structures around your particular parts of your body, so you can break a leg and never feel it. And so pain has a positive function in that sense. So if you stand on something, you want to be able to get away from it. If you have an infection, you want to be able to know that it's there in order that it can be treated. So pain in itself is not inherently evil. But pain that facilitates or feeds into like the kind of affliction that Simone Weil talks about, then that's when it becomes deeply spiritual, or she puts it, that's when it begins to mark your soul. So yeah, discomfort, pain, that's kind of ambiguous and neutral, but there are aspects and elements and ways in which pain functions which are clearly not.
At one point, Dr. Swinton, you had said that suffering can easily turn into evil. This kind of follows on from what you're speaking about. Could you kind of elaborate on that?
Yes, but one of the things that it's quite interesting to look at the conversation around theodicy, the way that's changed over the past 100 years or so. And so, if you go back to, I don't know, 200-300 years ago, it was a problem of evil, with evil assumed to be a force that exists in the world and that makes no sense because God, who is the opposite of that, should be getting rid of it, right? But what you notice a lot in a lot of contemporary work around, sometimes around theodicy, but also around suffering in general, is that people tend to use the language of suffering rather than the language of evil. So the problem of evil becomes a problem of suffering, and that's a very new development. And that's a development that emerges when you have an economy and a way of being, a level of well-being where suffering is no longer an option. Right? So if you are in a context where you have a high rate of infant mortality, for example, then suffering is not necessarily assumed to be an evil in that sense. It can become a part of the way of life. But if you're in a medicalized context like ours, where actually that's an aberration, then it's very easy to conflate the two. But actually, it's very often a cultural problem that we have. And so I think that part of I think my push towards a return to thinking about evil is just to say that not all suffering is evil, but certain forms of suffering become evil when they function in particular ways.
Thanks again. You mentioned the practice of homefulness, and as a student preparing for a summer in CPE in a Trauma 1 center, how would you recommend, or in what ways can we practice homefulness in the context of like medical facilities?
Homefulness.
Yep.
Well, one way that you could do that is by recognizing how significant a person's home is for their identity. Right? And there's two dimensions I put to that. We spend an inordinate amount of time at home, and most of what we do that's significant occurs at home. So therefore, part of who we are is tied into our physical home. When you're dislocated and put into, say, in your situation, an acute medical situation, then you lose that sense of identity because you no longer have that physical space where you make sense of the world and make sense of where you are. Now you're in a place of alienness, but you no longer have a home in this. Now it may be a short-term thing, or it may be a long-term thing. But either way, you have to reconstruct your identity in that context. So homefulness in that context would be facilitating a person to feel at home, but also to feel that they are valued, feel that their identity is sustained, even though a significant aspect of their life is no longer the way that it is. So that would be the case in acute care. But also, if you think about care of the elderly, you have exactly the same thing. In care of people with dementia in particular, when you have that movement from home into a care home, that's profoundly traumatic for somebody. And I don't think it's recognized how traumatic that is. And it's not, by the way, that people with dementia in particular really have their dementia exacerbated by when they move into that new context because there's something profoundly unsettling and disorientating happening. And I think there's something to be said for having rituals of homefulness that enable people to move from one mode of being at home into another mode of being at home to mark that space. So that would be the case for acute people, less so, but for people in that longer term situation.
But Sarah will have the last question. Who's able to ask a question because of pain has been dealt with medicine, right?
Exactly. Thank you, John. My question is about your exploration of taking medication as a spiritual practice. And I'm particularly curious about that in the context of what it sounds like Jen's community was about, which was about faithfulness looking like happiness and being cheery. And I know that in sometimes those communities, it's also unfaithfulness looks like taking your medicine. It looks like you haven't prayed enough. So I'm wondering what weighs into those kinds of communities, which I think a lot of us here are actually familiar with communities who might function in that way and think medication is not a spiritual practice. It is a sign of unfaithfulness to God. How do we start to care for folks in those communities, particularly people who are in pain and do need medication, but their faith community is kind of pushing against that spiritual practice?
Yeah, well, I mean, I have about 2 minutes to answer a dissertation-sized question. Right? But, I mean, the first two things. One, I think that people need to rethink their understandings of the nature of joy. So James talks about counting it all joy, counting suffering joy, counting happiness joy. But all these things come together. But joy is not happiness, but joy is Jesus. Right? And Jesus is one who is in the depths as well as in the high. So there's a theological issue that people need to really think about. And my church is a charismatic evangelical Presbyterian Calvinist church, which and we definitely need to think about it. So refiguring that understanding of what happiness is, happiness just comes and goes. That's not what joy is. Joy is Jesus. The second thing is to have a revised theological anthropology. So the Hebrews have no idea of your soul separated from your body. And so therefore what happens to your body implicates your soul and your mind and all these things. So when you take medication, it's not an atheological act. It's actually something beyond, before there was medication, there was God, there was theology. And within that, taking medication is an act that functions on an embodied creature. And it properly prescribed, it's a soulful action, something that is designed to minister the soul. So I think it's that idea of faithful administration of medication that begins to get beyond that, with a revised theological anthropology and a revised theology of joy.
Let's thank John again.